Hi, I'm Matt Nelson, Channel Technical Agronomist for Central Iowa. The year that was 2020 was unforgettable. Unfortunately, it was unforgettable for a lot of the wrong reasons. In fact, if 2020 was a car, it would be an AMC Gremlin. If 2020 was a candy, it would definitely be Circus Peanuts. If 2020 was a trip to the store, it would be one in which you forget what you're shopping for as you're walking through the store. You can't find your car once you leave, and when you get home, you realize that you forgot that bag of sugar that your wife really wanted you to buy. In short, if we could ask for a refund on the year that was 2020, I think most of us in agriculture would probably take Mother Nature up on that offer. That said, this challenging year did offer us a lot of invaluable learning opportunities, and my job here today, as your channel agronomist, is to try to help you unpack all of the lessons we learned from this growing season and try to figure out how we can apply some of these lessons to 2021 and to years beyond.
As mentioned, this is our 2020 Agronomic Year in Review. This presentation will give me an opportunity to address some of the challenges that we faced in 2020, talk about some of the observations that could be made, whether to specific hybrids and varieties and how they responded to stress, or how agronomic practices played out with the results we saw at the end of the season, and also give me an opportunity to talk about some of the various issues caused by this unpredictable growing season and how those factors ultimately impacted yield at the end of the year. As I mentioned, 2020 was a year of many challenges. Here are just a few of them. In April, we had a couple snows early in the year, depending on your location. This followed by windy days, resulted in dry soil on top, but wet soil underneath. We also had soils that were very slow to warm, as we did not accumulate very many GDUs early in the season. As we moved to May into the later part of planting, depending on your location, we had several different frost events, I think 2 or 3 if you were in Northeast Iowa. Dry conditions caused issues with our residual pre-emergence herbicides, and a lot of them failed to activate. And residue and compaction caused emergence problems pretty much across the state, particularly in corn-on-corn fields. As we got into the vegetative time of year, in eastern Iowa, we had remnants of a monsoon that brought anywhere from 7 to 10 inches of rain in a short period, and prolonged dry conditions in western Iowa. July, we saw the triple threat of storms, wind, and hail, depending on your location. Corn rootworm pressure also started to manifest itself in the form of root lodging, and we saw the effect of that prolonged drought, as well as some really hot, windy days and warm nights, affect pollination. And that was a large issue that we tracked as we moved into August. August brought more drought, actually the third driest in Iowa since 1980, and also the land hurricane, otherwise known as the derecho, that affected crop fields from west central Iowa all the way to the Mississippi River and beyond. As we got through the reproductive stage and into harvest, we saw snow in October, some late fall rain, and also as we progressed into harvest, some very windy days, which caused a lot of these very stressed corn plants to heave and give their last in terms of stalk lodging, which really delayed and made harvest very painful. As we go planting window by planting window, the first this year would have been early April, somewhere between the 1st to the 18th. These windows will not be 100% precise, but in general, these trends fit most of the state. We had warm conditions in late March, and it turned cool rather quickly once we got to mid-April, but in general, we had nice planting conditions to start the month. Soil temperatures were actually well above 50 degrees on April 9th, but they came below 50 degrees very quickly. We had, again, snow, as I mentioned, around this time as well. In general, crops planted in this window performed well and enjoyed nice conditions, which, again, drives home the reminder that when it is fit, if the long-term forecast appears to be warming, it's not a bad idea to go out and plant if you are prepared to do so. These were some social media posts from the time. As you can see on the left, that picture is dated April 8th. If you were in southeast Iowa, our soil temperatures were actually well over 55 degrees, and pretty much the entire state, with the exception of the extreme northern reaches, had soil temperatures above 50 degrees. By April 12th, however, 4 days later, as you can see in this next image, we were well below 50 and stayed there for a few days. This is some weather data from Nashua, courtesy of the ISU Mesonet, that shows our highs and lows and our GDU accumulation from April 10th through the end of the month. And what you can see is that early period there in April, while the highs were good and we had some warm soil conditions, the lows really dropped off, especially there around the 14th through the 16th, before they rebounded, and we actually closed the month with a lot of nice 70-degree days and soil temps that rose pretty dramatically, going above 50 degrees on April 22nd. The second planting window was April 18th through the 31st. In my opinion, a ton of planting was done in this window. We were warm. As I mentioned, we accumulated plenty of GDUs. If actually you had planted around April 18th or 19th, your corn probably would have emerged by the end of the month. We also had some issues with this planting window. Strong winds, particularly at the end of the month, really caused problems. I had farmers contact me who actually had to quit planting because so much residue was blowing back across the rows after they went by with their planter. And as I mentioned before, conditions were dry on top. We were throwing dust, which is always the goal when we're out planting, but we were wet at that 2 to 2.5 inch depth, which caused some sidewall compaction and some smearing. Looking at departure from normal temperature over the month of April, in general, April was a chilly month, but it varied. It depended on where you were at. Conditions were closer to normal for most of the southwest part of the state, but were much cooler as you started to move east. Again, looking at those GDUs accumulated throughout that early part of April, really not much happened across wide stretches, and it seemed to take a while for us to finally get close to that 100 to 120 GDU range. When I talked about compaction, compaction was actually not just limited to sidewall compaction from 2020, but also 2019 compaction as well. I got a lot of calls to go out and look at stands of corn that appeared to be struggling. This is actually a social media post of mine from April 30th where we definitely had some emergence issues, and as I began to dig down the furrow, I could pull up large chunks anywhere from 6 to 8 inches long where the sidewalls were really heavily compacted. Here are some other examples of issues that I saw. Furrows that actually did not close for various reasons. Some of these could have been planter adjustments. I think in general, we had a lot of furrows that were left open because we were planting in conditions that were a little too wet. We also had a lot of corn plants specifically leaf out underground. And leafing out underground occurs when we have really cloddy soils caused by either fall tillage conditions that are too dry, or sometimes spring conditions that are actually too wet and create large clumps of soil. When we plant into that, oftentimes what happens is as that seedling is starting to emerge, we're pushing up towards the soil. Sunlight can get in through those cracks, and when that young seedling sees light, it will start to throw leaves out. And if that ends up underground, a lot of those are seedlings that we end up losing. So cloudy soil is the main culprit there. The seed to soil contact was not what we wanted, and the conditions above that seed were not great either. We also had quite a bit of soil crusting, which mainly impacted soybeans. Here are a few other posts from some agronomists across the state. The one on the left, this is from June 10th, actually, so a bit later, diagrams some of the issues that we had with either stalks or other corn residue being rearranged after planting due to wind. And this residue actually caused several issues. One could be if your soil is at 2 inches deep when you plant it, and now it has 2 inches of residue on top of it, it now has 4 inches that it needs to try to push through. That could also cause nodal roots to develop in the residue instead of in the ground. It could also just tax that seedling as it tries to work its way through the residue. That also caused issues with soil warm-up. If there's heavy residue on the ground, what we found was that residue kept the soil beneath it from warming up as fast and from drying out, as that residue shields that ground from the sun and also holds moisture in. Matthew Darr here on the right posted a really nice video looking at sidewall compaction and how to check for that with a knife or a seed gauge. And essentially, if you can't penetrate the sidewall very easily, then your downforce is too high. If it requires work to get that knife in, you're probably compacting that sidewall. And I agree with what he said in this tweet. It's a 10-second check that can really save yield, as what we mess up at planting will continue to stick with us for the rest of the year. The sins of planting really did haunt us again in 2020. As we moved into May, we had a little bit better planting conditions. Really, the large issue here was dry conditions in the western part of the state and low GDU accumulation in northern Iowa. If you planted in late April or early May, I believe over the first 13 days of May, we accumulated 30 GDUs total. That is a very low amount. So that seed was sitting in cold, wet soil most places. We also had the frost events that we mentioned, which injured and killed some of the earliest planted soybeans in certain counties. Audubon County, for example, a lot of soybeans were planted in mid to late April. So fairly early for our norms here when it comes to soybean planting. In western Iowa, we actually had issues with soils being too dry, especially amongst very finely tilled soils. I stopped to dig some in some fields around May 10th and was having to go 3 to 4 inches deep to find adequate moisture for germination in fields that had been tilled multiple times. So a lot of that seed sat in the ground, and we were getting calls from farmers wondering if they should plant it deeper, say 3 inches or more, or if they should wait until a rain and just plant it at 2 inches and hope moisture comes at some point. Unfortunately, for most people in west central Iowa, the month of May did not hold much rain. A lot of regions only recorded about 4/10 over that entire span. Here are a few more pictures from northern Iowa. Again, low GDU accumulation. These cold temperatures also caused us to have some issues with pre-emergence herbicides. These delayed emergence issues caused some plants to sit in herbicides for longer than they should, which led to some buggy whipping and some products struggling to unfurl. And I guess one thing I really want to highlight here is the value of seed treatments. Those seeds that were treated with fungicide as they sat in that ground for 20 plus days, whether it was wet or dry, that only taxes that seed. And the more protection it has to get it up out of the ground and establish a healthy stand, the better. Specifically with regard to frost damage, we saw some corn actually get injured as well. Now, corn is normally insulated from frost until that growing point moves above the soil at about V5. But we did see some coleoptiles damaged. It depended on how close that seedling was to emerging and how cold that top bit of soil got. In general, as we've seen with past frost events, when young corn plants are injured, it looks ugly. We see that water soaking, kind of that drawn in yellow tissue, but corn plants recover very quickly. And I think in most cases, the frost did not really impact our corn long term in 2020. As we moved into the early vegetative part of the year, we had a lot of problems kind of rear their heads. One of the first ones we ran into was insect pressure. I mainly saw that take the form of white grub feeding down the furrow, some wireworms, and also actually some seed corn maggot injury where we had fields that had a lot of hog manure applied, and also some bean leaf beetle pressure if you were far enough south in Iowa. We had some herbicide injury and anhydrous burn due to weather conditions. In corn, we actually saw a fair amount of anthracnose leaf blight. Anthracnose shows up early on in the season as yellowing of those lower leaves. And while we saw a lot of it and it was widespread, it was mainly caused by rain splashing that inoculum up onto leaves. Does not necessarily indicate that you'll get anthracnose stalk rot. And in general, it was just something we kept an eye on early in the growing season. We continued to monitor uneven emergence due to soil warm-up and residue issues. In most cases, these uneven emergence problems did not require a replant, as that really takes more than half of your stand to come up over 2 weeks apart to really warrant a replant, but we did see that to be an issue. And as I mentioned earlier, we also worried about our pre-emergence programs not being activated due to a lack of moisture. Here are some more pictures, social media posts of uneven corn stands. This one on the left is a great one, as it signifies what we mentioned earlier, and that residue can really affect how these plants emerge due to the soil and how it warms up. And you see here a soil temperature difference of almost 10 degrees, actually over 10 degrees, and you can see the difference in the stages of those two plants. He gives a good rule of thumb there. For every 12 degrees, 58 to 70 of root and shoot growth will actually double. So with that being 4 weeks since planting, it actually makes sense. Looking at Nicole's picture here on the right, this is just a typical day that an agronomist would have had this spring, scouting and running into anhydrous burn, grubs, wireworms, and also some seedling diseases, mainly Pythium and Fusarium.
All right, so now to recap up to this point, we had rather variable planting conditions, whether it was dry conditions as you went west, conditions that were wet early on over in eastern Iowa and eventually started to dry out. We had issues with insects, with herbicides not being activated correctly, and mainly just fought a lot of issues with getting our stands up out of the ground and uniform due to the many reasons that I just mentioned. Also, as we rolled into June, it started to become hotter than normal and also drier than normal, which was not a promising trend as we rolled into our next stage of the year, the beginning of the reproductive stage. And I think this reproductive stage, particularly the end of July, is where we ran into a lot of problems that made it really hard to recover the rest of the growing season.
So we have now rolled into the pollination time frame, and I won't go through all of these specifically, but had you planted a 105 through a 115-day hybrid in Polk County, Iowa, across the late April and early May planting windows, the dates on the right would be kind of your expected date to the beginning of the reproductive stage. So as we're getting into that tasseling and silking time frame, this is kind of when we expect it to hit that. And I want you to keep those dates in mind of, July 10th through July 20th, essentially, as we look at the weather data for this month. As we can see, we were dry in late June, and that carried over into July. We were also much warmer than normal. As you look at the chart on the left, we see that in terms of a departure from normal temperature, we are much warmer than normal in the month of July in 2020. And as we look at the departure from normal precip, we see most of the state is now 3 to 4 inches behind what we normally get in the month of July, with the exception of southwest Iowa in places and also the nose of Iowa. Now, July is not a very wet month for us to begin with, so that lack of rainfall, especially with June being dry, really started to cause issues. In terms of our actual weather at pollination, we had a lot of warm days where the high was right around 90 degrees, in some cases as high as 94 as the average across that day. We also had respiration affected by a lot of really warm nights, causing plants to respire quickly and not giving that corn plant a chance to catch a break and kind of cool off overnight. A lot of fields also dealt with uneven pollination and tassel emergence. And this is actually the second year we've noticed this, where you'll see large swaths of a field, say 60%, that will throw tassels 1 week, and here 10 days later come the other set of tassels from those plants that struggled to emerge in a timely fashion. One of the biggest issues that we had in July was wind related, actually. We had a very large windstorm come through right around the 9th of July, as you can see in the top right. And that windstorm, as well as some others on the 11th and 12th, caused root lodging. Root lodging had a couple culprits. Some of it was rootless corn, or corn that had some sidewall compaction issues where those roots were not able to penetrate the soil very far by the time that wind came through. We also had some issues from corn rootworm feeding as well, which to find fields that were fed on in July is a little earlier than we normally anticipate. That was sped up by the dry and warm conditions. We looked at a lot of roots around that time and saw some significant feeding. We also started to see herbicide injury symptoms pop up, whether that was drift from soybean fields or corn fields, or in some cases actually crop response from how warm the conditions were when a lot of these herbicides were applied. One of the main windows that caused a lot of movement of herbicides in the state was a lot of the windy days we had in early June, when a lot of corn herbicides were being applied and some soybean herbicides were being applied as well. Here we've got some pictures of some of the wind damage that we saw. This picture is on the left and comes from Cedar County up in northeast Iowa, where that wind really did a number on a lot of corn plants. And really what it came down to was developmental stage. It seemed like products that had slightly different conditions, whether it was they were in a warmer part of the field or maybe actually in some cases had more compaction, seemed to fare differently than maybe other spots of the field. And a lot of wind damage, especially at this time, can really come down to different growth factors and how far along that crop is. We also, again, continue to see herbicide injury symptoms, as Megan Anderson from Iowa State noted, a lot more than we've seen in recent years. And I tend to concur with that as well. It was definitely a busy year for trying to diagnose herbicide response in crop and also caused by off-target movement. As we reached the mid-reproductive stage, not that you needed any more graphics to show how dry we were, but there's a few more here for your viewing pleasure. Essentially, what we're looking at is just a fairly historic drought that was going to take a lot of our yield away anyway when you couple it with emergence issues. And that was really the story of our reproductive time of year. And then we hit a very significant event in early August.
So, if you're scoring at home, we had issues with planting conditions not being fit, problems with emergence, insect issues, herbicides that did not get activated or caused injury, and prolonged heat and moisture stress that caused problems with pollination and most parts of the reproductive stages. On August 10th, we were delivered yet another blow by Mother Nature in the form of the derecho, which was essentially a land hurricane. And I think that's a day most of us will remember where we were. I was trying to conduct a new product training here in central Iowa and was spared having to go through the worst of the storm really just by a few miles. And I live here. The devastation was sad and still continues to shock and amaze me as we try to pick up the pieces. The one thing I wanted to take as a quick side note here was just to commend all of you on the strength and resiliency shown, the response of people helping their neighbors, and also of the community of people involved in agriculture here in the state who really tried to help farmers understand what their best options were as they tried to move past this event and figure out what the next step in their crop plan needed to be after we assess the damage left behind by this storm.
On August 10th, a large, basically land hurricane moved through much of the state and actually on into parts of Indiana and Ohio. And this derecho left behind widespread damage to both crops, homes, and also our agricultural infrastructure. This is an aerial image of what Iowa looked like on the day of the derecho, August 10th. And this was the derecho damage shortly afterwards. And while you can see large stretches of crop affected, the concentrated areas of damage kind of ran in those three circles that you see listed here. In total, we estimated about 10 million acres of crops were damaged or destroyed, and that went along with 50 to 100 million bushels of total storage capacity lost. Both things we will be feeling in our communities and on our farms for years to come is my fear. And looking again at estimated wind speeds, I probably don't need to spend much time reliving this, but some of the worst bands seem to run along Highway 141 and Highway 30 as we got over towards the Marshalltown, Cedar Rapids area. That area, it seemed, was particularly hit hard. As an agronomist, it was our job to try to go out and evaluate these fields to figure out what we could learn. And what we picked up were three different types of damage. Lodged corn plants, where they were tipped over at the roots. Kinked corn plants, where the wind had not actually pushed the roots over, but had bent the stalks. And corn plants that were just broken. And in our course of investigation, we noticed really different types of both effects on that ear as it finished, and also on yield potential of those fields. And what you see in this picture are ears from each one of these fields, and then on the right you can see the cross sections, the differences in kernel size, and actually you can see that the lodge plant is at about half milk line. The broken one has basically reached premature black layer already. And these pictures were taken not but 2 or 3 weeks after the storm came through. So we knew right away we were clearly dealing with differences in how this crop was going to handle this event based on the type of damage suffered. And on that note, this was an opportunity for us to learn something about hybrid response to 80, 90, 100 mile an hour winds. So highly anecdotal, but we did see that a corn plant that root lodged oftentimes meant it happened to a tall hybrid that was not anchored correctly or had some sort of issue with sidewall compaction or other planting problem. A kink stalk we tended to see in products that had a little bit weaker stalk. whether due to a thinner stalk because of high population or maybe just a hybrid that naturally has a weaker stalk. And actually, the broken plants, while the worst outcome for all involved, tended to indicate the strongest root and stalk strength. That plant was simply anchored so long and so well that after 30, 40 minutes of wind, it ended up just breaking clean off. This also led to kind of an open harvest window with really not much downtime. We had very dry conditions throughout much of September into October until we picked up some moisture here after about the 15th of October. So one of the benefits was a chance to do some early harvest. Some of that meant crop that prematured or reached black layer prematurely, but in general, it gave us a window to try to get things out in a timely manner. As we reached harvest, however, we started to have issues with things like stalk rots and ear rots. The ear rot issue was actually minimized. We expected to see more as we got into some of these derecho damaged fields, but we really did start to see issues that were hidden all year show up. Fusarium crown rot was one of the chief causes of that. That's a disease that moves in early in the season and eventually kills that plant off at the base or the crown. And we also saw issues with stress show up. Hybrids that did not handle stress well at pollination tended to zipper. We saw a lot of tip back, coronal abortion, things that indicated that our yield potential was clearly capped well before we got into the damage caused on August 10th. And this brings me back to a concept that I think is really important to cover, and that is Liebig's law of the minimum. As you see there on the slide, you'll see the formal definition, but essentially what it means is if we start to address other issues before we address the most limiting, our response to that is going to be limited. We need to correct what is deficient, what is lacking first before any of the other changes that we make will really have a great effect. And in this case, the example looks like maybe nitrogen is the stave causing the problem with this barrel. In 2020, by my summation, the overriding issue was moisture. Moisture, and you could also throw temperature stress into that as well. Dry conditions in Western Iowa really started in May and did not abate all year, and I would say still haven't abated. As we look at our soil profile for next year, the sponge is quite dry. We had the benefit of starting with a full tank of moisture in the spring of 2020, and at this point, that is not looking like a likely outcome as we head into 2021. In review, some of our trends, again, spring planting conditions, while they were drier and for a lot of farmers probably better than in years past, I continue to hear that they were the best planting conditions folks have had in years, and I don't disagree. We did have seedbed issues and issues from the fall before that lingered and caused problems with emergence and put seedlings under undue stress that led to some stand loss. Obviously, we had wind events both in July and August that caused some issues. In terms of trends there, we noticed the most lodging in corn-on-corn fields, and especially in fields that were very heavily tilled. It seemed that the finer that soil was at the time of planting, the less anchored those plants were. In fact, a lot of the rotated acres suffered much less root lodging compared to anything that was intensively corn-on-corn. But again, the main difference there was between how finely tilled the soil was or how well that soil kind of helped hold that root intact. The corn rootworm hatch was very strong. We saw a lot more pressure this year. We've had more favorable winters, and those kind of led up to a larger than expected number of larvae in 2020. As always, we sample those larvae, we submit those and always process to make sure that the traits are still functioning. And in general, that's what we've seen. The pressure has just been much higher than we've seen in years past. Some other issues: higher daytime and nighttime temperatures, plus drought conditions, pushed plants to the brink, and it forced them in a lot of cases to start to cannibalize the stalk, and in some cases even the ear shank, to try to fill out that ear. And what that resulted in were plants that were just kind of a shell of themselves, stalks that were lignified on the outside and in years past would not have stood. But by the time we got to harvest and faced some late winds, we started to see stalk lodging issues. Another thing that I've noticed with dry light spots is to make a 240 bushel yield average requires enough 280 bushel spots to balance out all of your 200 to 180 bushel spots on your lighter soil types. This year, we did not get any of the 280 bushel spots. And to make matters worse, the light spots of the field yielded more like 100 bushels or 80 bushels. Those two factors drug our total yields down into that 40 to 60 bushels below what we normally would expect. And I think that was really the norm for most farmers across the state of Iowa. As we think about the derecho again, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of stress for products that were lodged or affected by the wind. We really saw their standability be impacted as we moved into the harvest season.
2020 was eventful, wasn't it? Thank you for watching. I hope you found some of the information talked about here today to be helpful. As we look forward to next year, I really encourage you to pay attention to weather trends and your forecasts. Ultimately, Mother Nature drives this bus. We've known that for a long time. We cannot control what she does. And in 2020, she ran amok, and we were left to deal with the consequences. If our soil profile remains very dry and that outlook continues into spring, I would expect us to continue to endure some dry conditions. So, one, I would consider hybrids or varieties that have good stress tolerance and also good drought tolerance, as I think those could be big factors as we move into 2021. I also expect to see less disease pressure if we do have drier conditions. We saw that in 2020 as we had really a lack of your gray leaf spots, your white molds, or your sudden death disease in soybean. Another thing I think it can affect is your management plan. If it's fit to plant in early April, or as we saw back in 2012, possibly in late March, depending on your geography. I know that sounds early. You need to be prepared to start to plant some of your acres. As we've seen the last few years, while as an agronomist, I don't normally recommend those early planting dates. We've seen good weather conditions followed by long periods where the ground is not very fit and we're slamming a lot of crop into the ground in conditions that aren't quite ideal. So I think evaluating your planting windows and maybe having a couple different options as you plan out your spring is a good idea. I also think evaluate your fertility plans. If we are limited on moisture, what do you want to be doing from a fertility standpoint in both corn and soybeans? I think those are all important questions to ask and to try to work out an answer with your agronomist as we move into this spring. Thanks for watching and for tuning in. You can continue to follow us on social media. Our Twitter is @Iowa_channel. We appreciate all of you farmers for making it through this difficult year. And I'm going to knock on wood as I say this, but it's hard to see 2021 throwing more challenges at us than 2020 did. Of course, if that happens, you can blame me. I can be the complaint department for you. Thank you for watching. Take care. Stay safe.